The house was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that settles over a large establishment after the last servant has gone to bed, when the only sounds are the tick of the long case clock in the hall and the low murmur of voices from behind a half-open door. Helena Thurston-Crewe had come back downstairs for a book she had left in the morning parlor, her candle held low, her feet soundless on the runner. She was 38 years old, and she had lived in this house for 11 years, and she knew every creak of every stair, every draft that crept under the east wing doors in October, every corner where the gaslight pooled and every corner where it did not reach. She knew Marbury House the way one knows a place where one has been entirely alone, thoroughly and without sentiment. She was passing the billiard room when she heard her husband's voice, easy and unhurried, and she paused not because the words were meant for her, but because something in the tone, that particular note of a man speaking without thinking, speaking the way one breathes, made the candle flame shiver as if a window had come open somewhere in the dark. Inside, Marcus stood at the table with his cue, his brother Edward at the far end with a brandy glass, and the click of ivory filled the silence between them in a comfortable, masculine rhythm. Edward had been talking about his own wife. The affectionate, half-exasperated way men of their class talked about wives at 11 o'clock, as though the subject were slightly amusing and entirely settled. He had asked the same of Marcus, and Marcus, mid-shot, without lifting his eyes from the table, had answered, "Oh, I care for her like I care for the furniture, Edward. Quite genuinely. One simply doesn't think about it." Helena stood in the corridor. She stood there long enough for Edward to laugh, a short, comfortable laugh, and for Marcus to complete the shot, and for the ball to cross the table and click against the cushion and roll to a stop. She stood there long enough to understand that her husband had not said a cruel thing. He had said a comfortable thing, the way a man says what he has always believed without knowing he believed it, and that was considerably worse. She did not move until the click of the next ball. Then she walked back to her room. Her writing desk stood in the corner beside the window, where she had placed it herself 8 years ago because the light was better there in the mornings, and Marcus had never asked why she had moved it from the wall. The essay she had been working on before dinner sat exactly as she had left it, mid-sentence, the ink dry on the nib. She sat down, picked up the pen, and finished the paragraph. It was a good paragraph. She read it back once, made 2 small corrections, and set down the pen. She did not weep. She sat for a moment in the chair that she had chosen herself, in the room she had arranged herself, in the house she had run for 11 years without once being asked whether she found the work interesting. And she understood, not with the sharp surprise of betrayal, but with the flat, clarifying finality of a thing one has always known and simply not examined, that she had been living inside a very comfortable drawer. By 1 o'clock, she had opened the drawer of the writing desk and taken out the stack of pages she kept beneath her correspondence. 6 essays, fair copied in her own hand, each signed with the name Aurelius Penn, in the same ink she used for everything else, because the name had never felt like a disguise so much as a door she used when the front entrance was not available to her. She set them on the desk beside the unfinished manuscript and looked at them for a moment, and put them back. By 3 o'clock, she had written to her grandmother's solicitor, Mr. Aurelius Penn of Gray's Inn, requesting information about the availability of rooms to let in the Bloomsbury district, specifying her requirements: a sitting room, a bedroom, a table large enough for a writing desk, and noting that she would require occupancy within the fortnight. She had also written to Mr. Combe, her publisher, at his offices in Museum Street, to inform him that she would be calling in person within the week, Both letters were sealed and addressed before the first housemaid had come down to light the kitchen fire. She was, she thought, being entirely reasonable. She was not in a rage. She was not performing a dramatic gesture. She was simply making a practical decision in the same unhurried way she had always made practical decisions, with the difference that this one was for herself rather than for the household. She thought about the dinner party 6 years ago, the one at which she had offered a considered opinion about the second reform debates, something she had read about carefully and thought about for several weeks. And Marcus had laughed. Not cruelly. He had simply laughed, the way a man laughs at a child who has wandered into a conversation about matters that don't concern her and said, "Helena, you are charming," and turned back to his guests. She had not offered an opinion at her own dinner table since. She thought about her father, the Baron Ashfield, who had taught her Greek at the same table where he taught her brothers, because he said the mind did not have a sex, and it would be a waste of a good library to restrict it. She thought about the drawer in the writing desk, and the 6 essays, and the column in the Edinburgh Review that had devoted 2,000 words last spring to analyzing the argument of Aurelius Penn's latest piece. And she thought about Marcus, reading that column at his club and saying, at dinner 3 weeks later, that it was the finest argument for reform he had read in a decade, and Helena refilling his water glass and saying nothing. She opened the wardrobe and began, methodically, to consider what in this house actually belonged to her. The answer was more specific than she had expected. The writing desk was hers. Her father had given it to her the year she turned 20. The books were hers, most of them. The small watercolor above the fireplace was hers, a gift from a friend before her marriage. The clothes were hers, though bought with Marcus's money, and she would leave the more elaborate ones, the ones she had worn as furniture. She would take the plain ones, the working ones. She folded a gray wool traveling dress across the back of the chair and began to make a list. Outside, the October dark was beginning to thin at its edges. Somewhere in the street below, a cart horse shifted its weight and a wheel scraped stone. Helena wrote the list in her neat, unhurried hand. And when she had finished, she set it beside the 2 sealed letters and looked at all 3 together. She was not leaving out of pain. She was leaving because a woman who had been writing under another man's name for 4 years, in secret in the small hours before the household woke, was not furniture. She had simply been behaving like it. And the furniture, as she had decided sometime around 2 in the morning, was now choosing where it sat. Augusta Thurston-Crewe arrived at Marbury House 2 mornings later without sending word ahead, which was her custom, and proceeded directly to Helena's dressing room, which was also her custom, and opened the door without knocking, which had always been her custom, and which Helena had long since stopped remarking upon. Helena was standing at the open trunk with a folded gray dress in her hands. Augusta surveyed the room, the trunk, the bare dressing table, the absence of the small items that accumulate around a woman in residence, and said, in the brisk, carrying voice she used when addressing a situation she intended to resolve before luncheon, "You will stop this immediately." "Good morning, Augusta," Helena said, and laid the dress in the trunk. "You are making a fool of yourself. Marcus has done nothing. There is nothing here to leave over. Nothing that any reasonable woman could point to and name as cause." Augusta moved further into the room, positioning herself between Helena and the trunk in the manner of a woman accustomed to occupying space as a form of argument. "A wife of your standing does not behave this way. Whatever has got into you, you will put it away and come down to breakfast, and we will say no more about it." Helena picked up a second dress, dark blue wool, practical, and folded it with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "I will be leaving on the afternoon train," she said. "Helena, I will be taking nothing that belongs to Marcus. Helena set the second dress in the trunk and straightened. She was not a tall woman, but she stood in a way that occupied her full height. And I will tell you one more thing, Augusta. Because you have come a considerable distance this morning, and you deserve a direct answer. She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing her words with care in the way she chose words on the page. For 11 years I have been treated as a piece of furniture in this house, addressed pleasantly, maintained in good condition, never once asked a question that required me to think before answering. I do not blame Marcus for it. He has been comfortable. Comfortable people do not ask questions. She reached past Augusta to close the trunk's lid. But the furniture is now choosing where it sits, and it has chosen Bloomsbury. Augusta's mouth opened. It did not, for several seconds, produce any sound. This was, as far as Helena could recall, the first time in 11 years that Augusta had been in the same room with her without speaking. "You cannot," Augusta began. "I can," Helena said, without raising her voice. "I have written to Mr. Fenn. I have written to my publisher. I have packed one trunk." She turned to the bell pull. "I am going to ring for Thomas to bring it down now. You are welcome to stay for tea if you would like. But I will be leaving at 2:30 regardless." Thomas arrived, and the trunk went down, and Helena descended the stairs of Marbury House at 2:15 carrying the trunk, her writing desk tucked under Thomas's arm at her instruction, and a folded paper in her coat pocket bearing the Museum Street address of Mr. Coombs' publishing offices. She did not look back at the house, not from sentiment and not from the effort of not looking. She simply did not need to. She had already said what was true, and discovered, as she had half expected, that saying it aloud did not break her at all. Marcus read Helena's letter that evening in the library, standing because he had picked it up expecting something brief and domestic, and found himself unable to sit down. It was brief. It was not domestic. Helena had written 3 paragraphs in her clear, slightly formal hand, and in those 3 paragraphs she had stated what was true, without once raising her voice or making an accusation. She had not said he was cruel. She had not catalogued his failures. She had simply described, with the quiet precision of a woman who had been thinking carefully for 11 years, what their marriage had been, and what it had not been, and informed him that she had taken rooms in Bloomsbury, and would be grateful if correspondence regarding Oliver's school term was addressed to her there. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and walked to the window. Over the following 10 days, he discovered things he had not known he did not know. He discovered, standing in Helena's dressing room on the 3rd day, that he could not name a single book she was currently reading. He had known, in a general way, that she read. There had always been a book somewhere in the vicinity of Helena, but he could not have named the author or the subject of any of them. He walked to the morning parlor and found the shelf where she kept her current reading and stood before it for a long time, looking at the titles, and recognized none of them except the Greek texts, which he had not known she read in the original. He discovered, at his club on the 5th day, sitting in his usual chair by the window with the evening papers, that he could not describe to himself what his wife's voice sounded like when she was happy. He knew what she sounded like when she was managing something: the dinner table, a difficult guest, a household crisis. And he knew what she sounded like when she was being polite to his mother, which was a specific and particular register, but happy. He sat in his chair and tried to remember, and could not. He wrote. The first 2 letters were formal, which was how he wrote when he was uncertain. The formality was a kind of caution, a way of not saying too much before he knew what there was to say. The third letter was less formal. The fourth was a single page asking if he might call. He received no reply to any of them. He went to Bloomsbury on the 8th day. The rooms above the bookseller on Museum Street were up a narrow stair, and he stood on the landing in the rain for 4 minutes before the door opened 6 inches and Helena's hand appeared, holding a folded wool blanket and a cup of tea. The hand set both items on the threshold. The door closed. Marcus looked at the blanket and the cup of tea on the landing floor. He picked them both up. He sat down on the top stair, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and drank the tea, which was hot and very good, in the manner of a man who has nothing else available to him and knows it. He sat there for an hour while the rain continued, listening to the sounds from the bookseller's shop below. The bell above the door, the low voices, the occasional movement of someone on the other side of Helena's door. And then he walked home wet. He returned twice more in the following week. Both times the door did not open. He was not, he thought, a man who had done terrible things. He had not been unfaithful. He had not been unkind. He had simply, and this was the formulation that kept arriving in his mind with the flat, unavoidable weight of a bill of reckoning. He had simply never been curious. He had been married to Helena for 11 years and had never once asked her what she thought about anything that mattered. Meanwhile, in her rooms above the bookseller, Helena was writing. She wrote in the mornings, at the table she had positioned herself beside the window, where the light came in at 9 o'clock and stayed until noon. She wrote without concealing the act, without pushing the pages under the correspondence when a servant came in, without closing the notebook when she heard footsteps on the stair. She wrote because the thoughts were there, and the room was hers, and there was no one at the breakfast table to make the act feel like something requiring justification. 3 essays in 5 weeks. The first 2 she sent to Mr. Combe within a fortnight of arriving in Bloomsbury, and he published the second one in the November number of his quarterly. The third she was still working on when a column in the Edinburgh Review devoted its central 2,000 words to an analysis of Aurelius Penn's latest argument, calling it the most rigorous application of liberal political theory to the question of married women's legal standing that the journal had encountered in a decade. Marcus read the column at his club on a Wednesday afternoon and found himself, against any expectation he had formed about his own opinions, agreeing with every line of it. He read it twice, made a note in the margin, a habit he had when reading arguments he intended to use, and set the journal aside. He did not yet know why the voice felt like something he had heard before. He would think about that later, and the thinking would cost him considerably. Augusta, meanwhile, had begun her campaign with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had been managing social consequence for 40 years, at family dinners, from which Marcus was now frequently absent. Helena was described as having a difficult season, in the tone one used for women who had suffered some unspecified nervous complaint. Letters went to 3 mutual friends. A remark was made at a dinner at the Home Secretary's, to the effect that Lady Marbury had been rather overwrought since the autumn, and that one hoped she would recover her equilibrium before the spring. Augusta was not cruel in any of this. She was simply efficient, and she believed, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had arranged her own life around the same principle, that a wife's standing was inseparable from her husband's, and that any deviation from that arrangement was a kind of structural failure, like a wall coming loose from its foundation. The Royal Academy held its public lecture on the last Thursday of November, and both Marcus and Helena attended separately and without prior knowledge of the other. Helena had come for the lecture, a paper on the Elgin marbles, which she had opinions about. and Marcus had come because his secretary had put it in the diary, and he had not thought to remove it. They encountered each other in the first-floor corridor at the interval, in the press of people moving between the lecture room and the refreshment tables. Marcus saw her first. She was standing slightly apart from the crowd, looking at a painting on the corridor wall with the focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. And he stopped walking because the sight of her, in a dark blue dress he did not recognize, without the household expression she wore at Marbury House, was briefly disorienting, the way a familiar room looks different when all the furniture has been moved. "Helena," he said. She turned. She looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was deciding how to handle. Then, without speaking, she reached out and straightened his cravat, the way she had always done, 11 years of it. The automatic, unthinking gesture of a woman who has dressed beside a man long enough to treat his appearance as a matter of household maintenance. Her fingers adjusted the knot, smoothed the linen, and then did not withdraw quite when they should have. Her hand rested at his collar for a second longer than the gesture required. He did not breathe. She withdrew her hand, turned, and walked past him into the next room without speaking. Marcus stood in the corridor for a moment, then continued toward the refreshment table, where he stood with a glass of claret and did not drink it. Mr. Combe died on the 14th of December, of an apoplexy at his own desk between the Morning Post and luncheon, which was, as his widow Mrs. Combe noted to Helena 3 days later, very much in keeping with the way he had lived. Mrs. Combe was a composed, practical woman of 60 who had managed her husband's business affairs for 30 years from a position of formal invisibility, and she came to Helena's rooms in Bloomsbury on a gray Tuesday morning with a pot of tea and a proposal that she laid out with the directness of someone who has already thought through every part of it. A rival publisher, she named him, had learned of Aurelius Penn's identity through a source she had not yet identified, and had made an offer. A substantial sum in exchange for Mrs. Combe's confirmation. Mrs. Combe would not act without Helena's consent. Helena had 1 week. "If you decline," Mrs. Combe said, setting down her cup, "he may find another way to confirm it. The source exists. I cannot make it not exist." "And if I consent," Helena said, "then we choose the terms. We choose the venue. We choose the timing and the form of the announcement." Mrs. Combe looked at her steadily. "We make it yours, Mrs. Thurston-Crewe, or we let it be taken from you." Helena sat with that for a moment. Outside, the bookseller's bell rang twice as someone came in from the street. "Give me a few days," Helena said. That night, the letter arrived from Oliver's school. The headmaster had written to both parents, separately, simultaneously, with the quiet urgency of a man who has learned that fever in a 9-year-old boy can move quickly and is not inclined to reassure anyone unduly. Helena read the letter standing at the table, then put on her coat and went downstairs to find a cab. Marcus arrived at the school 40 minutes after she did. He came through the door of the sick room and stopped when he saw her sitting on the far side of Oliver's narrow bed. And she looked up at him, and they conducted an entire conversation in the space of 2 seconds, without either of them speaking. Then Marcus took the chair on his side of the bed, and they sat. Oliver was flushed and restless, his hair damp against the pillow, muttering occasionally in a way that made Helena's hand tighten on the coverlet. The school's physician came twice through the night and said what physicians said when they were being careful, that the fever must run its course, that the boy was strong, that they should watch for certain signs and send for him if they appeared. Marcus and Helena watched, and the night went on. Near 4 in the morning, the quality of Oliver's breathing changed, steadied, deepened, lost the shallow, quick quality that had kept Helena counting between breaths for the last 3 hours. The physician came again at 4:30 and said the fever had broken. Oliver slept. Helena leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She was very tired, and the relief was not the sharp kind, but the kind that moves through the whole body at once, slow and heavy, like warm water. She heard Marcus shift in his chair, heard the small sound of him setting down the cup he had been holding. And then she felt his hand, careful, deliberate, close around hers across the foot of the bed. She did not open her eyes. She did not pull away. His hand was warm, and she was very tired, and Oliver was breathing evenly in the bed between them. And she let herself stay in that particular moment without deciding anything about it. When Oliver woke at 7 and asked for toast, Helena withdrew her hand, bent to kiss his forehead, told him she would be back on Thursday, and left. Marcus was still in his chair when she went through the door. She was back in Bloomsbury before 9. On her writing desk was the letter she had begun 3 days ago to Mrs. Combe, declining the unmasking. She read it through once. Then she tore it in half. Augusta arrived at Mr. Combe's publishing offices on a Wednesday morning, unannounced, which was her custom, and without having considered that a publishing office was not a drawing room, which was her oversight. Helena was there with Mrs. Combe and 2 editors, Mr. Hartley of the Westminster Review, and a younger man named Sims, who worked with Mrs. Combe on the Quarterly, discussing the terms of the unveiling. They had been at it for an hour, and the table was covered with papers, and the room smelled of ink and cold coffee, and nobody had offered anyone a biscuit. Augusta opened the door and stepped in, and the room looked up at her with the polite, mildly curious attention of people who had not expected an interruption and were not certain what category of interruption this was. "Lady Augusta?" Helena said. Augusta surveyed the room. The editors who had not risen, the papers on the table, the atmosphere of purposeful work that was distinctly not a social call, and drew herself up with the particular bearing of a woman who has decided the room needs reordering. "Helena," Augusta said in the carrying tone, "I would like a word with you, privately." "We are in the middle of something," Helena said. "I can see that." Augusta's gaze moved across the table. "What I have to say concerns the family standing, and I will not be put off by." "Lady Augusta," said Mr. Hartley from the far end of the table, in the mild, unhurried voice of a man who edits one of the most widely read political journals in England and is not easily unsettled. "Forgive me. Have you read Aurelius Penn?" Augusta's expression shifted. "I beg your pardon?" "Aurelius Penn, the political essayist, published in 3 quarterlies over the past 4 years. The piece on married women's property was the one that drew the most attention." Hartley looked at her with genuine, unperforming curiosity. "We were just discussing it. I ask because if you haven't read it, I am afraid we are probably not the right company for you this morning. We are rather deep into the argument." Augusta said, in a tone that contained several years of social certainty, "I do not read political journalism." Hartley nodded pleasantly. "Then I think you may find us poor conversation, ma'am." The room was quiet. Mrs. Combe refilled her own cup. Young Sims made a small note in the margin of his page. Helena sat with her hands folded on the table and said nothing at all, because nothing was required of her. Augusta, who had in 40 years of social life never once stood in a room where her rank did not immediately reorganize the air around her, stood for a moment in a room where it had made no discernible difference to anyone. She looked at Helena. Helena looked back at her, not with triumph, not with coldness, simply with the steady, even attention of a woman who has somewhere to be. Augusta left without finishing her sentence. After she had gone, Mrs. Coombs set down her cup and said, "Shall we continue?" "Yes," Helena said. "We shall." That same week, Marcus declined his mother's summons to dinner by letter. A single, carefully worded page in which he told her that he would not be attending her table until further notice, and asked her, plainly, to consider something he had been thinking about for several weeks. Whether she had spent her own life being a person or being his father's wife. He did not know whether she would answer. He sent the letter and did not wait. The following morning, he wrote to Mrs. Coombs at the Museum Street offices, asking whether he might attend the next Royal Society of Literature salon. Mrs. Coombs' reply arrived by the afternoon post. He was welcome to attend, and he should come alone. 10 days before the salon, a reform measure came to the floor of the House of Lords, a piece of legislation dealing with the legal standing of married women in matters of property and contract, which had been argued over in committee for 6 months and arrived on the floor in a form that pleased no one entirely. Marcus had spent the preceding 3 weeks rereading every Aurelius Penn essay he could obtain. He had obtained 7, including 2 that had been privately printed in small numbers and were not easily found. He had read them the way he read things he intended to use, with a pencil, making notes, reading arguments twice when he could not immediately fault them, which was most of the time. When he rose to speak, the House was in its usual late afternoon state, attentive but not rapt. The benches arranged in the careful disposition of men who have already formed their opinions and are waiting for the formalities to conclude. Marcus stood, adjusted his papers, and opened his remarks by saying that he wished to begin with what he considered the most penetrating argument he had read on this question. Written by an author whose name was not yet publicly known, but whose reasoning he intended to place before the House regardless. He read 2 paragraphs aloud. The chamber was quiet in a different way by the end of the 2nd paragraph. The quality of attention had shifted, the way it does when something is being said that the room has not quite heard before. He set the pages down and made his argument from there, building on what he had quoted the way a good architect builds on a good foundation. He sat down. 3 men on the bench behind him leaned forward to ask where the passage was from. The speech was reported the next morning in the Times, the Morning Post, and the Standard. All 3 noted the quotation and the unnamed source. Helena read the reports in Bloomsbury, at her table, with her morning tea. She read them once, quickly, and then set the papers down and sat very still for a long time, looking at the window where the December light came in flat and gray and entirely ordinary. Then she picked up her pen and wrote to Mrs. Coombs. She would accept the unmasking. On her own terms, in her own voice, at the Royal Society of Literature salon. She sealed the letter and sent it down with the bookseller's boy before she had time to think about it further. That evening, Marcus came to Bloomsbury. He had not sent word. He climbed the narrow stair and knocked, and Helena opened the door and looked at him for a moment, then stepped back to let him in. The sitting room was small and warm and smelled of ink and the coal fire she kept burning in the evenings, and it was entirely unlike any room in Marbury House. Every object in it chosen for use rather than appearance, every surface occupied with work rather than decoration. Marcus stood in the middle of it and looked around, and something in his expression was not what she was accustomed to seeing there. "Mrs. Coombs wrote to me," he said. "She told me to come to the salon tomorrow week, and to come alone. She did not explain why." Helena considered him for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair by the fire and said, "Sit down, Marcus." He sat. "I am going to tell you something," she said. and I would like you to hear all of it before you say anything." He nodded. "My name is Aurelius Penn," Helena said. The fire settled. Marcus did not move. "I have been writing under that name for 4 years," Helena continued, in the same, even unhurried voice she used on the page. The voice that had only ever existed on the page until now. "The first essay was about the 1870 Married Women's Property Act and its practical failures. Mr. Combe published it. The second was about the reform debates of that year, which I had followed carefully and had opinions about as it happened, though I had not been asked." She paused. "The essay you read at your club in October, the one in the Edinburgh Review, was mine. The one you praised at dinner last month, the finest argument for reform you had read in a decade. That was mine. The 2 paragraphs you quoted in the House of Lords last week. Mine." Marcus sat very still. The coals shifted in the grate. "You have been quoting me at dinner parties for 4 years?" Helena said, without any particular inflection. "You have been agreeing with me in print, in committee, and this week on the floor of the House, without knowing it was me you were agreeing with." She looked at him steadily. "I am not telling you this to embarrass you. I am telling you because Mrs. Combe is presenting the unmasking at the Royal Society Salon in 10 days, and I want you to hear it from me first." Marcus looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. "Helena," he said, and stopped. "You don't have to say anything tonight," she said. "I have to say something," Marcus said. He stood up, took 2 steps, and sat down again. Not from agitation, but from the particular restlessness of a man who has too many things arriving at once, and is trying to put them in order. "I have been sitting in my club for 6 weeks trying to understand what I did." He looked at her directly, in the way she had not seen him look at her in a very long time, without the comfortable, unseeing ease of a man who has no reason to look carefully. "I kept thinking I must have done something specific, something I could identify. But it wasn't a thing I did, was it? It was everything I didn't do." "Yes," Helena said. "I was not married to you," Marcus said. "I was married to your presence. You were in the house and you poured the tea and you managed everything, and I never once—" He stopped. "I cannot tell you what your laugh sounds like when something genuinely pleases you. I realized that at my club, in my usual chair, and it was the worst thing I have thought in 6 weeks, which has been a considerable competition." He looked at her. "Is there any future, any version of things in which I might be permitted to learn you? Not to have you back, not to return to what we were. I understand that is not on offer. But to begin." Helena sat with that for a moment. The fire was low, and the room was quiet. And outside on Museum Street, someone was moving crates in the bookseller's yard with the rhythmic scrape of a man working late. She crossed the parlor, she stood before him. And she looked at him for a long moment with the focused, decided quality she brought to things she had thought through carefully. Then she bent and kissed him. Once, slowly, with the steadiness of a woman who has chosen her terms and will not be hurried out of them. She straightened and looked at him. "Come tomorrow week," she said. "Come to the salon. Sit in the room and listen. And then, when it is done, you can decide whether you are able to bear being married to Aurelius Penn." The Royal Society of Literature held its winter salon at Somerset House on the 18th of December, in the long first-floor room that looked out over the Strand, where the afternoon light came in low and golden through the tall windows and made the room look as it always did at that hour, as though someone had arranged it specifically for a significant occasion. The room was packed. Helena had not expected quite this. She had known Mrs. Combe had been busy, but the number of people present and the particular composition of that number was its own statement. Editors she recognized, and several she did not. 3 members of Parliament in the front rows, 2 cabinet ministers standing near the back, which meant they had arrived late and had come anyway. The president of the society, Dr. Alderton, at the small lectern at the front. And Marcus, standing near the far wall, alone, in the dark coat he wore when he intended to be taken seriously, watching the door when she came in. Helena walked to the front of the room. She had prepared the address over the preceding 10 days, working at the table in Bloomsbury in the mornings when the light was good, writing and revising with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that would only be said once and needed to be right. It was not a recitation of the famous essay. It was an extension of it. The argument taken further, applied to the specific question that the reform debates had left unanswered, refined by 4 years of thinking that had happened in the space between her public silence and her private voice. She stood at the front of the room and began. She spoke for 15 minutes. She spoke in the voice she had used only on paper, the voice with the dry, edged precision that had never appeared in a drawing room, the voice that could hold an argument and a counter-argument and a third position simultaneously, and make the structure of the reasoning visible as it moved. She spoke about married women and property and the legal fiction of coverture, about the gap between the principle of reform and its practical application, about what it meant for a mind to have no legal standing in the country it helped to govern. The room was very quiet. She was 4 minutes in when she saw Marcus's expression change. Not dramatically, not with any visible shock, but with the particular quality of recognition that crosses a person's face when they hear something they know, something they have read, something that is woven into their own thinking and understand suddenly where it came from. He did not look away from her for the remainder of the address. The room began to understand around the 8th minute. She could feel it. The quality of attention shifting, the particular stillness of people who are realizing something rather than simply listening. A whisper from the second row. A hand stilled on a notebook. Dr. Alderton, at the side of the room, watching her with an expression that had moved well past polite attention. She finished the address. She reached into the folder she had carried to the lectern and took out a single proof sheet. The title page of the collected essays, set in type by Mrs. Combe's printer the week before. She uncapped her pen and signed it. Helena Thurston-Crewe, formerly known to you as Aurelius Penn. She handed it to Dr. Alderton. The room was silent for a moment. The particular silence of a large group of people processing something that has rearranged their understanding of the preceding 4 years. Then Mr. Hartley of the Westminster, who was sitting in the 3rd row, stood up. He began to applaud. The room followed him, and the sound of it came up all at once, and Helena stood at the front and let it come. She did not look for Marcus until the applause had run its natural course, and the room had begun to move. And when she found him, he was still at the far wall, still watching her, and his expression was not the one she had prepared herself for. Not the careful, managed neutrality of a man deciding how to respond to a public situation. It was something much simpler and considerably less managed than that. It was the face of a man who has been listening to someone speak for 15 minutes and understood, in the way one understands things that cannot be unfelt, that he had been in the same house as this person for 11 years and had not once thought to ask what she was thinking. Afterwards, in the corridor, while the room continued its conversation behind them, Marcus came to where she was standing and said simply, "I read the proof." "I know," Helena said. "I have been quoting you for 4 years," he said. "You have," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You were right about the 1872 amendment. I voted the wrong way." "You were not the only one," Helena said. "The argument was new. It needed time." She looked at him steadily. "Come to Marbury House on Thursday. Bring no one. We can discuss the next measure, the one coming in February, and whether your position needs revising." Something in Marcus's expression shifted, and he said, with a directness that was new in him, or perhaps not new, perhaps simply visible for the first time, "I am not coming on Thursday to discuss the February measure." "No," Helena said. "I know you are not. But we will start there." The days that followed divided society with the clean efficiency of a sharp instrument. Half the drawing rooms of London were scandalized. A viscountess, writing political journalism under a male pseudonym for 4 years, while attending her husband's dinner parties and hearing her own work praised by men who did not know whose work it was. The other half were electrified. 3 cabinet ministers' wives sent notes within the week. A novelist Helena had admired for years wrote to request a meeting. And the Home Secretary himself sent a private letter asking whether Mrs. Thurston-Crewe would consent to a conversation about the language of the February reform measure, at her convenience, at a location of her choosing. At the next session of the House of Lords, Marcus rose on the question of the February measure, and opened his remarks by saying, without preamble, as Lady Marbury wrote in her recent address to the Royal Society of Literature, "The practical failure of the 1872 amendment lies not in its principle, but in its mechanism, and any successor legislation that does not address the mechanism will produce the same result." He made his argument. He sat down. 3 men on the bench beside him said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Augusta retreated to her dower house at the end of December and did not appear in London for the remainder of the season. She did not write. Helena did not expect her to. Augusta was not a woman who could easily afford to look at what Helena had become. Not because she was malicious, but because the looking would require her to ask certain questions about her own 40 years, and some questions, once asked, cannot be set aside. Helena understood this. She did not feel it as victory. She felt it as the particular sadness of 2 women standing on opposite sides of a wall that one of them had built herself. 6 months later, the Marbury House study had been rearranged. It had happened gradually, over the course of several visits, in the way things happen when 2 people are negotiating a shared space, without quite announcing that they are doing so. The large desk by the window was still Marcus's, covered in parliamentary papers and the particular accumulation of a working legislator. Committee reports, correspondence, the annotated proofs of speeches in progress. But a second desk had been brought in from the morning parlor, set perpendicular to the first so that the 2 surfaces formed an angle. And this desk was Helena's, with her writing box and her ink and the ordered stack of working pages that meant an essay in progress. The bookshelves, which had contained exclusively Marcus's books for 11 years, now contained both. Her Greek texts and political philosophy stood beside his parliamentary histories without apparent difficulty. The room smelled of coal smoke and paper and the particular combination of 2 people's work, which is a different smell from one person's work done alone. It was a Thursday evening in late June, and Oliver was home from school for the summer and asleep upstairs in the way of 9-year-old boys who have been outside since 7 in the morning. The fire was low, more habit than necessity, the evening still holding some warmth. Helena was at her desk, finishing a paragraph of the long piece she had been working on since February. The one that had grown from the conversation with the Home Secretary into something considerably more ambitious. Marcus was at his desk with a ledger and the draft of a speech he needed to deliver before the recess. Helena finished the paragraph. She read it back once, made a single correction, and set down her pen. Marcus closed the ledger and looked up. "Good?" he said. "I think so," Helena said. "The third section still wants work." "The argument about the 1834 precedent?" "The argument about the 1834 precedent." Marcus considered. "You could cut the precedent entirely and come at it from the 1851 case instead. The ground is cleaner." Helena looked at him for a moment, with the particular quality of attention she gave to arguments she was genuinely considering. "That would require reworking the second section." "Yes," Marcus said, "but the second section would be stronger for it." Helena picked up her pen and made a note. Marcus extinguished the lamp on his side of the desk. The arrangement between them was not conventional, and they had not made it conventional by pretending otherwise. Helena kept her rooms in Bloomsbury. She worked there 3 mornings a week, and the address appeared on her published work. And she valued the particular quality of solitude that the room above the bookseller provided in a way she had no interest in giving up. But she spent 3 nights a week at Marbury House, and the study had 2 desks, and Oliver had stopped finding any of this requiring explanation, because he was 9, and his mother was famous, and his father had quoted her in Parliament, which his friends at school found remarkable. The arrangement was quietly scandalous in certain quarters and entirely unremarkable in others, and Helena and Marcus had reached, without formal discussion, the same conclusion about this, that what other people found remarkable about their marriage was less interesting than what they were finding in it themselves. In the morning, the study filled with early light from the east-facing windows, the kind of clear, unhurried June light that comes in before the day has accumulated its weather. 2 cups of tea stood on a single tray on the corner of Helena's desk, brought up by the housemaid who had long since stopped finding the 2-desk arrangement worth remarking upon. Marcus's parliamentary papers were where he had left them. Oliver's boots were in the hall, muddy from yesterday, waiting to be cleaned. And on Helena's desk, on a fresh sheet of paper, before the first sentence of the new essay had been written, was her name. Signed in her own hand, in the same ink she used for everything else, with the same unhurried precision she brought to every word she put on a page. Helena Thurston-Crewe. Not a pseudonym, not a precaution, not a door she had to use because the front entrance was not available to her. Simply her name, at the top of a blank page, on a morning when London was waking outside the study windows. The carts on the Strand, the bells of the church 2 streets over. The particular early morning sound of a city that does not know or care what happened inside any given house the night before. Inside this house, 2 people who had lived together for 11 years without once meeting were finally married. Not in the way they had been married before. Not the comfortable, unexamined way, the furniture and fixtures way, the way of a house running on its own momentum, but in the way that requires 2 people to be present at the same time, in the same room, asking questions of each other that do not have logistical answers. Helena picked up her pen. Outside, London continued its morning. She wrote the first sentence of the new essay, and it was good, and it was entirely hers, and it had her name on it before she had even begun.